Thank you. Okay, hi everybody, and welcome to tonight's Sustainable Communities. It's our second meeting via Zoom, so if you could mute your mic if you're not ready to make a contribution or speaking. Geraldine, I think you need to mute.
Okay.
So yeah, as we're at the start of our time together tonight, it's customary for me to ask members to be respectful of each other, and to anyone speaking and presenting tonight. We're here to be a critical friend of the council, not create the war of the roses, and I will do my best to be respectful of you, your time and your contributions. So we're just going to move on. I'm just seeing if everybody is here. Do you have any apologies for absence?
You've got two substitutes, Chair.
Yeah, so
you've got Councillor Nick Draper subbing for Councillor Aidan Mundy and Councillor Eloise Bailey subbing for Anthony Fairclough.
Okay, and I think Councillor...
We're still waiting on Councillor Pritchard to join us.
Okay, so he's on his way.
He is, it looks like he is joining us now.
Okay. Any declarations of pecuniary interest? Nope. Minutes of the previous meeting. Can members confirm that they are a true and accurate record of the previous meeting?
Agreed.
Thank you, Councillor Holden. So our first item is then to item 4. We have a budget update from Caroline Holland. So if we'll just go over to her now to introduce that item, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I just want to draw your attention to the supplementary agenda item number 11, because that will also give you some context behind the update that I want to give you. Because unfortunately we don't have in front of you tonight detailed savings. But I didn't want to give you the opportunity to make sure that you can understand the position we're in, what we're looking to do, and the timings of when we think we will have further proposals for you to consider, and also to ask any questions that you may have generally on the budget and on the process, and what we're doing about the financial gap that we have. So clearly what we normally do is roll forward the gap from the previous year, look at updating some of the assumptions, and then come up with a revised gap. So that's what we started to look at. And certainly then on page 2, sorry, of page 4, so page numbers are slightly overwritten on the version that I'm looking at, so apologies. We showed that the gap that we started off with was for next year was 3.3 million, and then rising to 11 million over the term up to 24-25. What we did, in light of COVID and in light of some of the other things that we are aware of going on, we reviewed the assumptions that we had for pay, in particular starting off with that. So we had previously allowed for 2% going forward. We got a 2.75% pay award in this year. But in light of some of the comments now being made about needing restraint going forward, we have reduced down the assumptions for pay down to 1.5%, and you can see that that has actually reduced that budget gap there. Clearly, we will keep an eye on the situation as it develops, and in particular what it may mean for staff, but that is the situation that we're currently looking at the moment. Prices have been quite clearly impacted, with the CPI and RPI impacted by COVID and some of the basket of indices that people weren't able to buy with the lockdown that's been in place. So we've just updated the actual overall budget to see what levels of inflation we would get, and we've left that currently at 1.5%. We will look to review later on in the year to see if there's any changes and what that might mean. And I think the September CPI in particular has been lower than was previously forecast. So whilst that may cause problems for authorities with a housing revenue account and the level of rent increase, at the moment it only makes a marginal difference for us on price inflation. We clearly, going forward, had a look at then an excess inflation provision that we have, and we've looked to reduce that in light of lower levels of inflation generally that we think will come. Income has been hit particularly hard with COVID, So we're just trying to see about the assumptions we will make there. And clearly we had some good news with our pension fund revaluation being 103% funded, and we were able to make levels of reductions there. I can see Councillor Pritchard waving there about his sterling work as chair of the pension fund committee. Now, there were some various changes that we were expecting to come through for the next financial year. So we were expecting a spending review, a 3-year spending review. We were expecting a fair funding review. So the spending review would look at the amount of money given to each government department. The fair funding review would then look at the allocations within local authorities as to who got what. There was also meant to be a business rate reset and business rate retention clarification as well. So currently the business rate retention scheme is at the 75%, but we participate in a pool. So when we looked at also some of the levels of grants that were due to come in, made various assumptions around those, but we've now been told the spending review will only be a 1-year spending review in light of the uncertainty with COVID. I think sort of they need to see the impact on the economy and generally on tax revenues and that to see what they can afford going forward, and some of the assumptions then around what we can do. There's been no announcement yet about whether we can do an adult social care precept or if there's any increase in the council tax referendums. So we have built in 2% increase over the life of the budget and no council tax, no adult social care precept at this stage. So when we rolled all those forward, it did make an improvement to the position, but that was before we got to COVID. And what we were then looking at, so if on page 25 of your report, it showed that the gap had actually reduced to 1.3 million and to 8.7 million over the life of the medium-term financial strategy. However, when we then looked at COVID and the impact on future budgets, so clearly we have had impact on our income levels. There are some expenditure items which are likely to continue. Does the economy bounce back and therefore impact on business rates? So we looked at 3 scenarios around savings not being achieved. So we report regularly through the financial monitoring and the level of savings and likelihood of their achievement, and looked at the growth. We have some levels of growth built in for Office 365, some contract lets, and for other expenditure items coming out of the peer review and internal challenge, and also scenarios around our dedicated schools grant deficit. So normally I am very much in favour of you plan for the worst and hope for the best. When you look at page 26 at what that gap could then mean if we took the worst case scenario in each of those options, a gap of 33.3 million next year is, I think, too significant, and I don't think not all of those will come to pass. So what we said, we'll look to approach it on the even level assumptions and then set out savings targets for each of the departments to achieve, rolling forward any unachieved savings from previous years. So the savings targets that were set out on page 29, and departments have been tasked to go away when we look at the gap for next year for 16.7 million, rising to 18 million over the life. So that's what directors and officers are working on and coming back with. We also had a look at the capital programme and said with the scale of the issues that we have, the only changes to the capital programme, unless they are statutory and urgent, would be through the review of SIL and the use of SIL to fund various schemes. So those have already started to come forward through the September, October, and now the November monitoring, which has been published already. So there's been very little change to our capital programme, although we are asking people to look at the slippage, because I do not think that the level of spend currently input for this year is likely to be achieved. So we do need to reconsider that. So the timetable, whilst published for September, I think we are still looking at what that means, because we're not going to now get the spending review until the 25th of November. we're not likely to get our settlement until the week commencing the 21st of December, which clearly is then after the next cabinet in December as well. So we're trying to work through the options and scenarios to make sure that Scrutiny has a chance to consider proposals that will be coming forward, as well as giving you the chance to understand the impact of COVID on our budget and what that means for our budget gap going forward. So that's quite and we've set out then on the Appendix 2, the draft MTFS, which has sort of some further details pulling together all of the assumptions. I know that was quite a quick run through, Chair, but quite happy to take any questions or if I can answer them. I certainly looked at to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline. Are there any questions for the panel? Councillor Butler and Councillor Holden.
Yes, thank you, Chair. And this the dedicated school grant deficit isn't directly related to this committee, but if we're considering savings going forward, very much is a consideration. And thank you for that presentation, Caroline. It's always really clear the way you present things to help us be able to scrutinise things. So thank you for that. Can I just ask how long the DSG deficit has been on our books as a consideration of risk as it is here? How long it's been an issue for us that we have to consider strongly in terms of how we plan forward?
So we first went into deficit in 2018-19 and had just under a 3 million deficit. Significant deficit then last year, up to, I'm just trying to find from the latest monitoring report because we have some information on there. So bear with me. So I can give you the latest information on it. So the deficit last year was 12.7 million, and we're forecasting currently a 14.4 million deficit in year again for 2021. So there has been some change to the accounting guidance, and we're waiting for a statutory override to be laid in Parliament to say that we do not have to meet any further deficits from our general fund. However, with the size of our deficit, which we reported to January Cabinet last year, the scale of our deficit could actually be more than our general fund balances and our earmarked reserves. So that's what we're just trying to update that 5-year plan to see how much that has changed and what that may mean for us as we go forward. But certainly it's only in the last couple of years that it's really started to get significant for us. Thank you.
Councillor Holden and then Councillor Pritchard, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Caroline, for the presentation. I'd like to ask what sort of level of predictions have gone into this from the different departments. So, for instance, Park and Services was heavily relied on in previous years. Have they sort of indicated how much a bounce back they're likely to get? Because we do know that level of fines and things are going up quickly again. So what I want to know is how much a true position these budgets are likely to be and how well predicted they are.
So if I take you to page 25 of the agenda item 10, I think it's 10 or 11, you'll see there income, loss of income, high level bounce recovery, income levels revert to pre-COVID levels, even level service income is down 20%. So that's what we are assuming. There will be a sort of a 20% reduction. And we've then been tracking the parking income levels throughout the monitoring report. And indeed, in the month 6 report that has just been published for November's Cabinet, there has been an improvement in parking income. However, that was before the lockdown is announced for Thursday. So that may have a further impact. So we will need to review again what the likelihood of that impact may be. And I know Chris and Kath are on the line as well. So they may have already started that work, or it may be still too early to see what thoughts they have on that. But certainly that's what we have assumed for next year.
Councillor Pritchard.
Thank you very much for explaining this. My question specifically about DSG, and forgive me, I just don't really understand it that well, which is this deficit's been built up. You're waiting for some sort of statutory instrument or override to be laid down. what is the direction from central government with regards to it? Are you, I mean, where are you in terms it? Everyone talks about, indeed Daniel was just talking about clarity of sort of forecasting, but we don't really have clarity over this yet, and this is not forecasting. And I was just wondering what absolutely is the sort of central government's direction on the way that this should be accounted for, and whether or not they expect us ever to have to pay for it, or et cetera, et cetera.
So there's the accounting body for local government, SIPFA, has started some work in this area, but it's only addressed one side of the problem. So they said, oh, you can have it as a negative balance on your balance sheet. That doesn't necessarily help us, because theoretically then we are the lender of last resort. It could impact on our value for money if the level of our deficit is higher than our general fund and earmarked balances. So certainly by the end of this financial year.
Could you say that last sentence again? Sorry,
Yeah. So our general fund balances are currently 13.7 million.
Mm.
Our deficit assumed by the end of this year will be over 26 million.
Mm.
So you're beginning to see that out of kilter. We're looking to update the grant over the 5 years. And previously we had up to sort of 75 million deficit. That would then be more than our earmarked balances and general fund balances. So to then say, oh, we don't need to provide for it, we really do need the DFE to fund us, but there is still
I don't think anyone
to do that. And until they will clearly say, yes, we will fund you for this, or they say, okay, we'll fund you for your deficits going forward, but we've not got that clarity at this stage.
So sorry, I'm just, all you're expecting in the statutory instrument going towards Parliament is permission to carry it in your accounts. It isn't a resolution of, where's the money?
To carry it in a different place in our accounts, and to say, we do not expect that you should meet this from general fund balances or general fund items, but it's not clear if you're, and I don't think many authorities will be in our position. They haven't thought through the unintended consequence of if your balance is lower than your deficit.
Okay, that's clear. Thank you. Well, as clear as I can expect to be.
Yeah.
Sorry, Councillor Draper actually wants to go next, and then I'll come back to you, Councillor Butler, if there's nobody else who wants to speak who hasn't yet.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. I again, I'm like Owen. I'm looking for some clarity on this, and I suppose the question that I'd ask, I think I know the answer, is this a question of underfunding or overspending? Because I know that there will be those who will accuse us of doing that. I'd imagine this is a more general problem to councils across the board, and I don't think that we do overspend in the sector. But I'd like to have a having heard what you just said to Owen, I would like a really simple answer as to whether we have been spending too much or whether we've just not been funded enough.
I'm not sure I can always give a simple answer, but what I can say is we have had a significant increase in our education, health and social care plans, which then drives the level of provision that's to be provided. So I would say certainly a main factor is that we don't have sufficient funding to follow that level of increase. We are looking to reduce the call on the dedicated schools grant, which is why we have been expanding our special schools, but we struggle to find the land to expand special schools to the level of places that would be needed. We've also seen quite an increase in the education requirements for children over 16 up to the age of 25. So there is still that increase in the range of care being provided, and that extension, which I think came in 2012 or 14, hasn't yet dropped out. So we're still always seeing an increasing number of children coming through without that being their tail off. So
just very quick, sorry to beg your pardon. So coming quickly back on that, there's been these increased responsibilities, 16 to 25, etc., but there's not been increased funding to follow it.
It's sort of normally based on the cost per child, but our placements are expensive, and the level of need that our children need, which is then proven by times when we look to change it by a court, it's very difficult to remove a care package for a child once they do get it as well.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
I'll go to Councillor Butler and Councillor Pritchard.
Thank you, Chair. My internet might be going off, but hopefully I'll get what I say will come out. And first half of this is probably just a comment, just again hitting home what Owen and Nick have just said. A comment you don't have to respond to. From what I'm understanding here is, you know, we're saying we need to provide this much help to special needs children. The definition of that has increased, that the amount of people that come into that bracket. Those within that bracket have needed more help, and it's obviously difficult to get the tail off there. But my question would be, are other councils in a similar position of having to be the last resort funder as we are being?
So certainly there are other boroughs in London, and they've been in this position for longer. And the DfE is meant to be contacting them to work with them to see about their deficit recovery plan. We did have a visit from the DfE, and they said, "Oh, your deficit recovery plan will now be a deficit management plan." So we're still waiting to see if there's a golden one that they can be waived to deal with the deficit. But with our increase in EHCPs, it's the parents' right to have that care package then for the child, which we then need to provide. So that's where the challenge comes back. But there are other boroughs who have been in similar positions, and so we're working with them as well to see what the impact is and make sure we do a similar treatment in the accounts.
Okay, we'll move on to Councillor Pritchard, and then we'll move on to our next agenda item.
I suppose because Ben covered what I wanted to ask, but I just want to pull up a word really, because we say sometimes that we want to, you know, we think we need to cover this. But can I be absolutely clear, I think, is that these are demand-led services that we're statutorily obliged to cover, and therefore the only lever that we have to pull really is to increase the organic capability within the borough to reduce the costs. We can't alter the demand because we're obliged to do it. Therefore, all we can do is reduce the cost of supplying the capacity by insourcing into the borough. But at the moment, we're having problems doing that for the reasons you laid out at the moment. Problems largely beyond our control to do with real estate. But really, this is just demand-led. We don't have, you know what I mean? Going back to that core question that Nick asked, it is, you know, is it us overspending or is it just increased? This is demand-led, and we've got no option but to meet it. Is that a fair summary of where we are currently?
I suppose we still, I mean, Rachel may have a different opinion of this, but I still don't have enough information to understand why we have the demand at such an increased level compared to other colleagues in London. So that's where I would say there could be a slight disconnect, but we've been trying to do some work in this area because of the impact that it has. I would say, just to draw your attention then to when we put in the DSG deficit, we're saying that we're only going to fund 50% of the gap going forward. So even within these numbers, we are not fully funding that gap at this stage. So any change to that policy will not have, there will still be some gaps to be provided for.
And to be clear to all listeners, we're not planning on funding any of it. That's the government's responsibility. We're just assuming funding of it for reasons of accounting.
We're providing funding.
Yeah.
Aside for it, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Caroline, for taking us through that and being as clear as ever and helping us understand it. It's very complex. Thank you so much. So we'll move on to agenda item 5 now, which is Clarion Housing Repairs and Maintenance. We've got John Furman, Jane Bolton here with us, and Mike Robbins as well. So this is Clarion coming back to us. They were here before we went into lockdown, I think.
2 weeks before, Natasha, yeah.
It's like a long time ago now, doesn't it?
It's another world.
So they're back to kind of give us a bit of a progress update on what's happened, and colleagues will have seen a note that went round that Rosie circulated that was given to us before the meeting. So I'll just hand over to John and Jane and
Thank you.
Mike now.
Natasha, I think before we look at the note that came round, I thought it would be useful for the scrutiny panel to have a small presentation from us on lockdown and our response to lockdown, because that's been by far the biggest thing since the last scrutiny. So I would like to share my screen. Can you all see that? Yes, wonderful. Let me set up the slideshow and start. So, as I said, we met with you, I think, 2 weeks before lockdown. The world has really turned up on its head, and so I really wanted to share with you how we tackled lockdown from the start to where we are now. So in terms of background, we had to very much invent new ways of working. We had disaster recovery planned a number of ways of working, but they were all short term. They were buildings going down, various things. What we hadn't envisaged was every member of our staff suddenly having to try and work from home. So we were very busy in trying to get a service up and running and keep a service going. We had differing messages from the government and the regulator of social housing. So when the first lockdown happened, the government were very clear that nobody went out, that we were not to attend our properties. The regulator of social housing told us in no uncertain terms that very important things like gas safety checks still had to happen. And it took us a couple of weeks before we managed to persuade the government as an industry to allow us to do those things. So we were in a little bit of a hiatus in late March, early April. We then had the issue about people being able to travel. For those of you who remember, there was, again, this ease, but there was still real uncertainty about who should and shouldn't travel. We tried to keep a lot of our services going, so we thought it was very important that our estate services people kept grounds maintenance going to keep things clean, and we had a few care workers in Live Smart schemes, as well as, you know, certain contractors who would do things like the gas servicing. What we found out is that a number of our staff were being stopped by the police, asked why they were out during lockdown. So we quickly had to give written authority to everybody who was traveling for work to allow them to get about and do their job. We had very significant pressures on our IT services to ensure everyone had the ability to work from home. Not everyone had the right equipment, but certainly the pressures on our servers and things like that changed. So they needed to really up their game to allow us to continue working. And we also had differing views from our residents about what constituted an emergency. We had some residents who still expected us to see us, still expected us to show up. And then some residents who, when we did show up to either clean or even to do something like a gas emergency, were telling us we shouldn't be anywhere near their home, and we listened to the government, and why were we out? So I think it was a lot of muddied and mixed messages at the start, trying to formulate the service we wanted to provide. In terms of service provision, we actually worked quite quickly with IT, and we managed to get all staff working from home successfully with the right equipment within the first 4 weeks, the vast majority being up and running in week 1. So that was a real success for our IT department, and really allowed the service to be almost seamless. We worked through what constituted an emergency, constantly reviewing what messages we were getting from the government and the regulator, and also ourselves, and we managed to get that out to staff, but also posted on our website and for the call centre, so we could get a clear message out to our residents. We developed a process, as it says, to agree social distancing protocols with each resident before any interaction took place. And this would be phoned through to the resident and then be checked again on the doorstep to protect both staff and residents if we were going to have any interaction with them. We had formulated safe working practices to allow our estate services team to continue. we took a very early stage decision to have the estate services teams continue working where possible. This was not a decision taken by all housing associations in London at the start, but we thought it was really important in terms of hygiene on the estates, in terms of keeping things clean, that where we could, we had staff up and running and delivering services. And even though shielding was in place and things like that, we managed to get about 75% of that team up and working and delivering services right through lockdown. And then we devised a system to contact vulnerable residents to carry out welfare calls. One of the things we realized is that people would potentially be feeling isolated. We vowed to telephone or contact by letter all of our residents who are over 75, and then moved down to sort of 70-year-olds and 65-year-olds as that capacity increased. In Merton, we directly contacted 350 residents, and of those, just under 300 we managed to do by phone. It was generally incredibly well welcomed. You know, we managed to find some who were not isolated, but we did find plenty of people who were not seeing anybody, were very just very glad to have any form of contact and to know that people were thinking about them. What we found was we managed to engage with our residents more quickly and reached a wider range of residents during this time. You know, we quite often resident involvement is quite standard in the way it's delivered. We try and move away from just having broad meetings where people attend, but we found everybody was forced to upgrade their technology, and so things like Zoom and Microsoft Teams became things people were used to using, and it allowed us to talk with residents groups, engage with residents who wouldn't normally have the time to see us or speak to us, and so that gave us a broader range of views and allowed us to help shape what we were doing during lockdown. We moved residents and stakeholder meetings to Teams, adding flexibility and allows us to stay in touch. I know, Natasha, you attended a Merton community panel meeting on Teams, which proved very successful, and we've got another one of those coming up in a couple of weeks. And we had other such meetings. And, you know, I think today is a really good case in point that you can still provide this level of scrutiny you need with the modern technology. What we saw during lockdown was a marked increase in reported ASB, and we needed to shift our resources around both within our contact centre, but also within our team to try and meet that. As Jane says in the report she produced, you know, we saw a 64% increase, I think, if from memory, increase in workload, but talking to other housing associations across London, some were reporting more than 100% increase. And this, I think, is probably, if you look at what experts are saying, is due to people living on top of each other, which is putting pressure on households, but also being home 24/7 meant that people were being more aware of their neighbours and maybe less tolerant of their neighbours' behaviours because they were living with it all the time. We started working quite strongly with partnership organisations to help support victims of ASB, and that's continued outside lockdown because those workloads and those numbers haven't really dropped off since. When lockdown was introduced, Clarion moved to a critical repair service. If you remember back when lockdown first happened, and we couldn't go out and we couldn't actually attend. Our partner contractor put a number of staff on furlough quite quickly because there was no work for them to do. Our calls dropped. I think we were getting 38% of normal calls, and quite a lot of those weren't to do with repairs. So we moved on the 23rd of March to only doing essential health and safety repairs. Oh, I've done that one. That lasted until May, and in June we moved through, in July we moved through into emergency and urgent repairs, as well as routine. So that was coming out of lockdown. We recognised there would be a significant backlog of maintenance work that needed to be done. So we introduced new categories. Normally, we would have two categories of emergency and urgent being one category and routine being the other. But here we extended times for routine repairs to 56, 84 and 168 days. And they were really to allow, those are maximum times for things, but they really were to allow the schedulers to categorize things into things that needed to be done more urgently, less urgently, and then really things that could be picked up as routine repairs when there was a slot to do them. This was really to allow us to bring staff back off furlough for NG, but also to allow us to pick that up over a reasonable amount of time and work quite successfully. That was scheduled to run through until the end of October. But what we found is it was working successfully enough for us to stop that and move back to normal timescales on the 25th of September. So from the 25th of September, our urgent and emergency is 24 hours and our routine is a maximum of 28 days. Again, looking to fix it around the customer and actually find a slot that suits them. What we've learned.
Sorry,
Sure.
Say, I just want to be conscious of time.
Sure, this is the last slide, Natasha.
Okay, brilliant, excellent.
Okay, so what we've learned, we're reviewing what visits really need to be done face-to-face and what we can do remotely to protect residents and staff. We found that there's still not a lot of confidence with people coming into houses, and a lot of residents are preferring us now not to visit them. And so we're looking at policies and processes to actually see what can be done over the phone now. We're wanting to maximize the use of the technology we now all use. We're looking at what future service delivery looks like, who really needs to be in offices every day, who can work remotely and who can work out on the patch. And finally, we're trying to retain flexibility for future lockdowns to allow a full or a bridge service to be delivered as we transition through any restrictions imposed. So thank you.
Thank you very much, John. So I'll just go back over to the panel. Does anybody have any questions? So I will, I think, thank you so much for taking us through kind of your response. Obviously, it was a challenge for everybody. But I think it'd be good to hear people's thoughts on the report that went round as well earlier.
Absolutely, yeah.
And just kind of the progress on maintenance and repairs in general, and kind of, you know,
sure,
how you're handling that that service. So are there any questions? Anyone actually wants to go first? Anybody? No? Okay. Councillor Butler.
Yes, thank you for that, and thank you for your work and what has been a very difficult time for all of us. There have, I don't know, in your paper earlier, you did mention that some inquiries from members and council members have gone up in the time. I think from my own experience, a lot of the customers that are coming back to me, the residents that are coming back to me, were worried about this kind of, again, recognizing the difficult job you've had over lockdown, is the kind of the firefighting element of it in terms of reorganizing your priorities and things. But I think, especially from my perspective in Abbey Ward, High Path, you know, there was a few strategic things that were still outstanding that people felt that weren't covered. I mean, just from my, you know, this, I don't want it to be dragged down into specific complaints that I'll raise, but you know, the general feel of the estate was, you know, the big things like bins still weren't, you know, being updated in a time where people were extra conscious about the hygiene of things, and they felt that those things really, I think from the view of Clarion helping them perspective, you know, there was a few kind of key hygiene things like the bins and the state of the kind of communal spaces that really didn't help in terms of people's fear about hygiene and health. I was wondering how you thought specifically about those wider things over estates, and how, you know, reducing either the perception or real actual connection to the degradation of health and people being more at risk, and how you want to do that on a wide level.
Thank you. I think we recognise exactly what you're saying. It is a very difficult balance for us at the moment. As I said, we're working 70 to 75% of staff within the estate services team during lockdown. And coming out of that, we are still probably at about 85% now maximum, with people now having to take leave and do various things. The difficulty there is not so much the numbers as the working practices that are allowed and what that allows us to do, where you would potentially get gangs of people coming onto the estate of workers to work together to sort something out. We're now very aware of those people keeping distances from themselves as well as from other residents, and so actually what we're able to do and how we're able to work is being very governed by our health and safety team and the protocols they lay out to us. It does restrict us in some way. We do try and get that balance right, Councillor, but you know, I recognise from what you say that it won't always be visible. It's a challenge. It's a constant challenge we're reviewing all the time. I think, you know, we would welcome, obviously, you bringing to our attention specifics, and we can address those specifics, as you say, but the balance between what that team can do when they are working as individuals or working maybe as twos, travelling in a van maximum, is a different type of service that we can keep things going at the moment until those restrictions are eased.
Any other questions? Councillor Holden.
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. It sounds like you've done quite well clearing the backlog, but now as we enter winter where and also lockdown, and also this is a time of year when repair needs become apparent, have you worked through what your plans are more specifically for this one, given that
Sure.
you need to actually continue with some repairs?
Yeah, I've got good news there. Obviously, the restrictions are different this time. So NG have confirmed they'll be working business as usual, because the government restrictions allow work that can't be done from home to continue. They also recognise that a repair service is an essential service. So NG won't be furloughing anybody, that we will be able to travel, and obviously within certain restrictions, they will be able to go into people's homes unless they're at risk. We've also checked with our supply chains, because we had some difficulty with our supply chains in the original lockdown. Sourcing equipment was very difficult. That's not an issue anymore. Supply chains were already gearing up for Brexit, but they also have learned the lesson from the first lockdown. So they are giving us reassurance that they have all the components we'll need. So I think we are very confident that we can continue to, while the restrictions are the way they are, that we can continue to offer the service we've been doing since we came out of lockdown in July, and certainly keep the timescales as they have been since September.
Councillor Butler wanted to come back in.
Yeah, thank you. I had 3 total questions and you've answered the second one of them, so thank you for that. And this might be a difficult question because the nature of it, and that's why I'm bringing it up, but a lot of the challenges in these types of things are thinking about the people you might not be reaching. And obviously you may have thought about this with your kind of change of office as well, in terms of the provisions you're making for the most vulnerable customers and residents. In terms of this, are you thinking there are people that, you know, regularly need your assistance that aren't coming to you? How are you approaching people, you know, identifying people who might need your help but aren't coming through to you? I think as a councillor as well, I'm dealing with that in my head of like, who's not calling me anymore, or who
Sure.
You know, even with the restrictions, how can I be trying to find these people that might be finding it difficult to get to me at the moment?
It's a really good question. It's difficult to find the people you don't know, but I think it's reasonable because we have some quite settled housing teams who've been here a long time, and they know the sort of people who will be in contact with them. And one of the things they've been doing is reaching out to those people and trying to check that they're okay. The estate services team also know people, and they're out on the estates all the time, so they're seeing people, and people, if they don't see people, they may go and give them a knock and see that they're okay. But again, we would welcome, if you have any concerns about any of our residents who would normally contact you and who you are not seeing, then please let us know, and we can try and, you know, contact them and check that they're okay through our networks.
Councillor Holden, do you mind if I ask a question quickly, or do you want to come in? Okay. So in the paper that you circulated, there was a mention of section 20 consultations coming up for a lot of refurbishment works, and as needs to be done. I think the last time you came to the panel, there was a discussion around when a resident can find somebody else to do the work for them and get better value quotes and things like that. And it's kind of transpired that the parameters by which a resident can do that, i.e. what type of contract they're allowed to use, or kind of what qualifications or work they've done before, what makes them appropriate to kind of do the work. I was wondering if you looked into that process at all since our last meeting, and if not, will you be able to? And also in terms of talking about resident engagement and keeping the good stuff of being online and doing Zoom consultations and things, is there more scope to do that within the section 20 consultation process to make sure that everybody is truly heard in that?
Mike, could you pick up the first point, Mike?
Yeah, with employing their own contractors, what we have is we have a partnering agreement already in place with, we carried out an initial section 20 process where we tendered all of the work. So we tendered the original major works agreement. So we tendered those works, I think it was 7 years ago, when it was Circle Housing, and those works were then tendered. And at that point, leaseholders were able to put forward their own companies or their own people to carry out that work. We went through the process and the due diligence, and that's where we came out with United Living as our contractor.
I think it may be worth adding, Natasha, that obviously that was following OJU processes, which are European Union processes. Now, obviously, that may again change following Brexit, so we'll obviously be up for review after that. But that's the process where we are at the moment, and those contractors have been appointed for large scale after that consultation. I think in terms of what you were suggesting with us using technology and potentially taking that into broader consultation, we're trying to embrace anything that we're using now and broadening that out. So I think it would be very likely that we offer digital consultation through channels such as this going forward, as well as potentially having meetings still on site. But I think digital consultation is going to become something that people are very used to, and we will definitely embrace it and adopt it.
But just on the section 20 stuff, I'm just kind of wanting to ensure that we're getting best value for the residents who have to then pay back that work. And if we've already got a contractor in place, are we happy with getting best value?
We went through. Oh, sorry, Mike, go on.
When the contractor, with the specific items of work, so if we're doing decorating or if we're doing window replacement or we're doing concrete repairs, they will get quotes for us. So they will get a number of quotes, and we will look at those and we'll get the best value for the leaseholders and for the association itself. Sorry, John.
Saying the scale that we get when we went out to tender, studies show that gets us a better price from a big contractor and allows that to happen. But as Mike says, the individual parts of a specific contract, we will scrutinize all the time if they're going out to bring in parts of that business. So that's where we try and drive that through. The difficulty is we can't have a contract with sort of the local supplier of just down the road. It's not the way it's set up under the regulations we have. That may change, as I said, after OJU. I don't know if it will or not. But
any other questions? Councillor Holden.
Yes, thank you. In terms of when residents need to contact you, reading your report, it mentions that an increasing number have not followed your processes, but instead have come to the MPs or even councillors. Do you have a sort of reason why that might be, that people are not following through your processes? And is there anything that can be done to improve that, or let us know a preferred mechanism to contact you?
I think we really want to encourage people to come through the processes. I mean, it's a difficult one, isn't it? we have debated, not to be honest with you, we've debated saying to you as councillors and as MPs when you contact us, actually this is the first time we're aware of this, could you tell your resident in future to go through these channels? But we've decided that's too onerous for you, we shouldn't be asking you to do that. So what we try and do is take it if people come to you. I think it's one of two things. I think in some cases, people come to you because they feel you will get things done. And so, you know, and they're used to it. Maybe you dealt with something for them before and it was successful, so they come to you again. And we have to accept that's the way. We also have Siobhan McDonough as a local MP, and Siobhan has regularly gone and done door knocks across the estates. And so people will give her team first time faults that they may have within the house, and then she'll report them through. But I think we also recognise that we had a drop down in calls during lockdown, but then we had significant increase in calls coming out of lockdown, which we've tried to deal with. But I think, you know, hand on heart, there are some calls where people will be waiting a long time and may lose patience, and that they'll look to where they can bring their cases up. This is something we're working on constantly. Abandon rates are dropping. We're managing to answer more calls. We're managing to move more people into the contact centre to answer those calls. We're also, there've been directives out from for staff into how to use the calls and whether the staff should be phoning into the contact centre to actually free them up to allow them to take more calls. So it's something we're constantly working on to try and make that happen. We've also got a big digital program where we're trying to move more and more onto digital. So if we can, we will in the next few years have more and more self-serve options that will have been tried, tested, and actually allow people to find out what they need to know without needing to contact us at all.
Any other questions? No? Okay. Okay then, well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Let you go. I'm sure we'll have you back again at some point in the future.
Lovely.
And yeah, thank you for your work, and I look forward to probably seeing you again at the next High Park Task Group meeting.
Indeed. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. Good evening.
Okay, so we're moving on to agenda item 6, which is the housing strategy, and we've got a presentation from James McGinley. If he's here, I can see his name, but not his name. We're popping up soon, I think. James, are you here? Ah, there he is. Oh, James, we can't hear you. Have you got like a Bluetooth headset or something? Oh, you're frozen now. Modern technology promises so much and then takes it all away. Sorry, James, you're frozen. Oh, there you go. But you're not frozen now, but I can't hear you. Can't hear you. Sorry.
Chair, is it worth moving on to the next item, support for private renters, and then coming back to James?
Yeah, that sounds like a very good idea, Rosie. Let's do that. So we'll come back to agenda item 6 once our tech issues have been sorted, and we'll move on to agenda item 7, which is support for private renters. And we've got Phil Howe from who's the Assistant Director for Strategy and Improvement for the Community and Housing team, and he's going to present the report for us.
Thank you, Chair. Stepping in for Steve Langley, unfortunately, who isn't well. So the report is for information report setting out the different layers of support that are available to private rented sector, which is important because as the detail of the report sets out, it accounts for pretty much a quarter of the housing supply within Merton. And it's a complex area of legislation, over 140 acts of parliament and over 400 individual regulations, but there to protect, in the majority, the private rented tenants and to guide the local authority in terms of the support that's available to individuals. And the report detail then sets out the 6 main areas of support and the different interventions, and further detail within the report sets out the teams involved and some of the background and detail of work and caseload at the moment. Housing standards and enforcement, which is at 2.1, plays a significant role in terms of good housing standards. And I think it's worthwhile recognising that the majority of housing is in good condition and well managed. However, there are detailed regulations there to support individuals when that's not always the case. And the council teams take proactive approaches to dealing with rogue landlords and improving the condition of housing in the borough. The table below in 2.1 sets out where housing enforcement activity is taking place. And you can see from that that the three top areas, two of which cover quite a lot of different strands under the general HMO, housing of multiple occupation, and housing other codes. But significantly, housing disrepair is pretty high on the agenda as well, and rising in terms of the number of complaints and areas of housing enforcement that the team has to deal with. Housing in multiple occupation obviously is an area that Scrutiny will have heard of before, and also its links to selective licensing proposals that have been part of the conversation previously. So HMO relates to housing of 5 or more people, and there's 246 licensed HMOs in the borough, and it's a constant piece of work for the housing team to understand any other HMOs that exist in the borough. People may be aware the definition of HMO changed fairly recently, and so it's an ongoing piece of work to ascertain if there are further premises that should be licensed in the borough to safeguard occupants. Just draw your attention to a note on civil penalties, which is an alternative to prosecution for certain specific housing offences under the Housing Act. And Merton has been successful in taking forward civil penalty notices with landlords as recently as early this year. The report then goes on to talk about our duties in relation to prevention of homelessness at 2.4, and sets out a table of the homelessness preventions taking place over the previous 5 years, showing that it remains a fairly consistent position. But I would point out that in relation to 2021, as the report sets out further, in terms of what has happened under the pandemic, we know that there's been the memorandum on evictions, which has been extended further and further until the 20th of September. There hasn't been any further announcement that will continue or be reinstated as a suspension as we go into further lockdown measures. The regulation changed in terms of the notice period. So previously it was 3 months, it's now 6 months. So that would mean that as the ban was lifted September, it's likely to be the spring, the early months of 2021 that we would see any resulting evictions going through the courts and coming to pass. So there is still a pent-up demand potentially for private rented tenants and any eviction notices that have been served. So we're yet to see the impact of that in terms of the Homelessness Reduction Act and the work that the teams will be doing with individuals. The final thing I just want to point out, which isn't directly related to the support to the private rented sector, but it shows our partnership working with the private rented sector, and that's the section that sets out the work that's happened under the pandemic in relation to rough sleepers, following the Everybody In initiative and working with the temporary accommodation set up by the GLA and local temporary accommodation set up. We now have a piece of work which is about moving people who are previously rough sleeping into long-term sustainable accommodation, and the majority of which is a partnership with private sector landlords. So all the aforementioned regulation and interventions from the team is even more significant, particularly where we're placing individuals who've previously been at risk within the private sector, and therefore the enforcement and all of the work that the team does for that group of people, if you like, is a microcosm of the work that the team does across the board for the private rented sector. I'll leave it there. I'm happy to attempt to answer any questions, but I may also reserve the right to take some of those questions back and get answers to you over time.
Very much, Phil. Can I go to Councillor Bailey, please?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the presentation, Phil. I have a couple. First question I have is, you mentioned proactive action for rogue landlords, but I can't. Sorry if I've missed it, but I can't see anything descriptive listed in the report. Can you give us an overview of what proactive action you do take and what that means?
Yeah, so a lot of it is based on intelligence, and it's proactive in the sense that we may be alerted to action required where we've not previously been involved with a landlord. Quite a bit of it also relates to the aspect, as I discussed, around ascertaining where those properties are possibly in breach of HMO licensing and getting those on the licensing radar. Quite a lot of the detail that's in the table that sets out the enforcement activity, the vast majority, as I say, in terms of the catch-all statements of general HMO and housing other, that's where we see the most proactive intervention, and there's teams on the street and teams behind the scenes understanding where the private sector landlords are within the borough. And it's spot checks and all those kinds of things to make sure that the regulations are being followed.
Councillor Holden?
Thank you. Yes, a follow on from Councillor Bailey's question. In terms of finding out about houses that have, let's say, too many people in and being illegally sublet, do you have any procedures in place to try to identify these, or do you just rely on intelligence from the community? I mean, for instance, do we make use of council tax records or anything else in the cross-departmental or even from government to try and identify these? Because we don't want to find ourselves on the news like other councils have.
No, absolutely appreciate that. There is a lot of proactive work based on intelligence, and there is data sets that, again, reminding people of conversations that have gone previously in relation to selective licensing. So I can ask that those intelligence sources can be divulged to you in terms of it is based on things like understanding the sector, where those properties are. There's factors involved in terms of crime and disorder, etc., that all feed into an understanding of where enforcement may be required.
Councillor Dean.
Natasha, it's Geraldine. Can I ask a question, please?
Can Councillor Dean? Yeah, sure. Okay, then Councillor Dean.
Thank you.
Go on, Geraldine, you start.
Oh, you want to do me now? Sorry. Okay. Yes. Talking about the work you're doing with the registering of HMOs and stuff like that. We've also got a huge problem, certainly in my area, with private landlords who are not necessarily operating HMOs, but are putting up people in really substandard accommodation. We can't. The tenants are unable to get any sort of information from them because they don't divulge where they actually live. They don't actually live on the properties. A lot of them are living abroad somewhere and just raking in the money. And we have been looking. I know Martin Welton, cabinet member, has been looking at setting up a private landlord register so that everybody would have to comply with our standards of housing before they could be put on the register. And I just wondered if there's any sort of update on that, please. Thank you.
I can't give you any specific update on that, but happy to take the details of where things like that are happening, as you've explained, and I will work with the team to understand any update in relation to a landlord register locally.
Thank you.
Councillor Dean?
Yes. So this is a broad question, and it's something that may not be answered tonight. But it's regarding rough sleepers, which tends to have a wider range of departments dealing with it today. One of the things that I think many councillors have noticed over the years is, although there's a lot of emphasis on rough sleepers, and there are very many reasons why there are rough sleepers, one of the things that we've noticed is that there's a disconnect between finding a house for them and getting them off the streets, and what happens in between. Because if there isn't housing, if there isn't overnight accommodation, they've got really nowhere to wash their clothes, have a shower, get a haircut. There are a few places, but each time I've visited them, and other councillors I'm sure have done the same, there isn't enough space or enough time for all rough sleepers to be dealt with. So certainly in Wimbledon, there's the Salvation Army, but really it's the only place where rough sleepers can get a shower. And I'd really like to see if we could expand that element of rough sleeping, so that the people involved, they often say that their biggest issue is that, you know, people won't approach them because they smell, they won't approach them because they look, you know, they're uncomfortable with it. And they find that incredibly tough. So I'm not decrying what happens, but I just feel that there needs to be a more focus on trying to keep them neat and tidy, trying to get them the opportunity to fill out forms, and therefore giving them more chance of getting into some accommodation.
Yes, thank you. I take that point on board, and I think certainly with regards to the Everybody In initiative, we have been working in a completely different way in some respects with multi-agency. There is a much more of a focus around those initial steps to access and encourage people to access that initial, what we call the emergency or immediate accommodation, and then do all of that work alongside with other agencies, with health input, etc., to try and stabilise the position and then give people the best chance to move on accommodation. So I think you're absolutely right, and I'm happy to draw out more on that detail of the work that we've been doing over the months. I would add, as the report reflects as well, that we have had success more recently with regard to further investment from the next steps, following the Everybody In. So the government's next step approach, we've grant funding there, and some of that funding is specifically about initial temporary accommodation, as well as the wraparound services that we need to provide to people.
Any other questions? I think Councillor Welton wanted to give an update on the landlord licensing.
Thank you, Chair. In terms of landlord licensing, this is something in principle that we do want to introduce as a council, because we know it will improve the lives of private tenants in terms of the condition, and where it has been implemented, it has made a real difference in terms of housing, but also as well in terms of enforcement. For a selective landlord licensing scheme to be introduced, it does need to have a volume of evidence. There has been cases where schemes have been struck out, and it also needs to have the evidential weight. Clearly, prior to COVID, we had carried out a lot of work on that. But at this present time, whilst we would like to have a selective landlord licensing scheme in place, we know that further work would need to be carried out before we could bring one forward to council.
Councillor Draper.
It's a question actually from Martin. Given what you just said about how complicated it can be, is there opportunity for landlords to voluntarily license themselves as a precursor to the scheme being universal?
I think in terms of licensing, there's already significant requirements in terms of landlords. If you have above 5 tenants, they do have to register, or above 3 stories high, and obviously pay a license fee. And clearly, if they don't, we can take enforcement action against them. I suspect you wouldn't get many people that would voluntarily do, but obviously good landlords have very good standards, and there is some very good landlords out there. But alongside that, unfortunately, there is bad landlords. And what I will say is the introduction of penalties, civil penalties, I think will make a difference because prosecutions do take a long time. We have undertaken 3 prosecutions. We've also issued civil penalties, and we're determined to issue more civil penalties and have more prosecutions going forward. Clearly, the last few months with things being put on hold has prevented more cases coming forward, but there is a number of cases that we are actively investigating as a council.
Councillor Holden.
Yes, thank you for that. A follow-up. All these ideas sound quite good, but it sounds like to me it will involve an increased level of resource. So what consideration has been given towards that, given our current condition we find ourselves in?
I think we do have to bring resources into this. I think that's a matter, and obviously there would be a considerable setup costs. Clearly, you would recruit costs over a year, but clearly, given the hugely challenging financial round that's likely to be coming up shortly, I think in the immediate term, we won't be bringing one forward. But I think it's something we would obviously like to introduce as a council. But certainly, I think that landlord licensing schemes can be self-financing, but initially there is those setup costs.
Okay, if there's nobody else who wishes to say anything, we'll move on to our next item. Okay, so we'll go back to James McGinley for the housing strategy. Can we hear you?
Would it help if you unplugged your headphones entirely from the machine, because the news of the machine sound itself?
Oh yeah, that's good.
There we go.
Yeah. No, we could hear you then. We could. Voice frozen again.
That's where he's gone very, very still. You can do that,
Oh. James, we could hear you then for a second. I don't think you can hear me now. Okay. James, can you hear us? Because I think we can hear the back. Can you hit that background noise? I think that background noise, I think, is you. He's typing in the chat. This presentation better be amazing. Okay. Well,
no, he's having technical difficulties. He seems to be unable. He sent the link to his phone, left, rejoined, having trouble styling in. I do have the presentation that James shared with me earlier in the day. James, is it worth me going through those slides?
He can't hear you.
Okay. Would you mind moving on to performance monitoring, Chair? Let me give James a call.
Okay.
Separately and see if we can work this out.
Okay, brilliant. So I'll go to Councillor Butler, who's going to just talk over the performance monitoring and bring out any key highlights. Then we'll go over to Chris Lee and his team to answer any questions.
Thank you, Chair. I guess my main point before we begin here is that obviously over coronavirus and COVID-19 restrictions, I'm imagining quite a few of these have been affected in ways that, in more complex ways than come out on these pages here. The big one for me would be parking to begin with. The reduction in that. A question I'd ask Chris on that would be, which elements of the parking charges are we seeing reduce? Especially, is that primarily due to the town centres in Merton and the demands there in businesses, or is that more widespread? And how are we kind of looking towards predicting where that is fitting in terms of both our budget, but also where we think that will be in optimistic outlooks on further restrictions or not, but also our other predictions about the kind of local businesses picture. But also another big one for me is the picture around recycling. It's showing here, and if I'm understanding it properly, a reduction in the amount of recycling that's coming through. Is there any predictions on there about, is that directly, do you think, connected to the COVID situation? Do we know what other boroughs are going through in terms of recycling trends, and how do you see that going forward? That would be my first highlights, Chair.
You're okay to answer, Chris? Thank you.
Yeah, certainly. And colleagues may wish to add a bit more detail, but taking those two particular questions, starting with parking, which is quite a complex picture, because you'll see from the parking revenue that we're significantly down on the estimates. And it's different for different elements of the parking revenue that we receive. There are three main elements in the parking revenue. There's what's called PCNs, penalty charge notices, for people who overstay their welcome on a yellow line or in a parking bay. And in PCN, the revenue there is actually at about the level that we estimated for the year. So motorists are not complying with the regulations. They're parking on yellow lines or on loading bays, and they're overstaying their welcome where they're parking in a pay and display. The next area of revenue is around on and off street parking, and there the estimates, we are significantly down compared to the estimates. So motorists are not visiting our car parks as much as they did, nor are they parking and paying as much on pay and display on street. So in that area, it's significantly down. And the third area, again, where it's down, is for an area called moving traffic offences. And that's for offences committed in bus lanes, on yellow boxes, or where motorists turn left where they're not allowed to. And those are just some of the examples. And again, the estimates and previous history shows that that's significantly down against the estimate. Now, it's still a very much an evolving picture in terms of parking and motorist behaviour, but we've seen a fairly significant change in that behaviour in outer London. Traffic volume is up, but as you can see from the description, the behaviour is not comparable to what we've seen in previous years, particularly around on and off street parking events where it's down. The other area where it's slightly down against estimates is around the volume of permits bought. And this is where some of the policy that the council adopted may be starting to have some effect, in that the number of annual and visitor permits is below the numbers that we expected. Now, we don't know whether that's as a result of COVID or whether that's a result of the nudge that we've given to the motorist, because it's too difficult at this point to separate and understand what the driving force is, excuse the pun. But that picture is still emerging. And Kath, James may wish to add in a moment to that picture I've described. But then just turning to waste volumes, and here I'll ask John to add a bit of detail as well. This is again a picture that's consistent across London. And that what we're seeing is with more households working from home, waste volume, residual waste volume is increasing. And it's increasing disproportionately compared to the amount of recyclable waste. So whilst there is more recyclable waste being generated, it's being outweighed by the amount of residual waste that's having to go to the energy from waste plant. And that's, at least we believe, partly as a consequence of more people working from home, generating more waste that would ordinarily be commercial waste generated in a workplace and paid for as commercial waste. Instead, it's getting into the residual bin and the council taxpayer is having to pick up the bill. And that's quite a significant bill because we're having a lot more waste that we're having to take to the energy from waste plant. And whilst there is more recyclable waste, it still has a price against it and it's not increased as much as the amount of residual waste that's increased. But I'll just turn to Kath and John in turn to see whether they wish to add to both of those pictures. I don't know, Kath, whether you wanted to add on the parking picture.
Well, I think it's fair to say that every single income stream that we have in parking has been affected. And as Chris also said, it's very, very difficult at times to determine quite why some of those streams have been affected in the way they have, how much of it is COVID. But certainly when we went into lockdown in March, I mean, visitor permits plummeted, annual visitor permits plummeted. A lot of people who were working from home suddenly decided to stop buying season tickets. I think our off-street car parks at one point were 80–90% down on top of, against what we would have projected in terms of income against them at that point in time. And I think whilst on-street parking is recovering and has been recovering over the latter months, I mean, obviously another month's lockdown is going to hit those figures again. So it's a pretty bleak picture. We have started during that period from sort of June onwards, we have started to see increased income levels. But I don't, as I said, there's even other things like bay suspensions where people would have been having skips for construction and all that kind of thing. Every single stream has been affected in one way or another through that. We also suspended the sale of scratch cards during that period. It was impossible to do that. And what you get when we sell rolls of scratch cards to people is we'll get a greater amount of income. Instead of somebody paying £1 or £2 for a kind of visitor's parking session as a one-off. So we are keeping it under close scrutiny. And we've also got a claim going into government to try to see if we can recover some of that loss of income. But at the moment, it is a difficult position as far as parking is concerned.
I wonder whether John could just add to the picture on waste.
It's hard to add to such a solid answer in reply to the initial question, but Chris is right in the sense that we are looking at increasing volumes of residual waste just due to the fact of more people working from home, which is limiting the amount of in percentage terms of the recyclate waste that we're managing. However, we're seeing an increase in the number of container requests for recyclates at home, which is a positive. So maybe through a rebound, we will see a higher increase of that residual waste being recycled. So we will keep a watch on that value. Thank you.
I think Councillor Dean wanted to come in and then we'll go to Councillor Holden.
Yes, I think the first point is about scratch card parking permits. It's critical that the council recognises that not everybody has computers, not everybody has smartphones, not everybody can read or write. And it's very, very important that scratch cards are always a part of permits because, sometimes, people are away and people have to go around and they've posted the scratch card in the post to say, come round on Tuesday and do my windows or whatever. You can't set that kind of thing up on Ringo. So regardless of the software problems with Ringo, please never get rid of scratch cards. There will always be a small percentage of people that really can't do without them. On a second point I'd like to make is the figures here just show how important drivers are to the London Borough of Merton, not just to the amount of tax they bring in, but also to the high street economies. So it's critical that that should be remembered. And the third point I have to say is on recycling. Labour Council have probably broke their all-time record. 126 months in a row, you failed to hit your recycling target. 126 months. We should have a bet each month. You give me a tenner if you miss your recycling target. And if you hit it, I'll give you a tenner and I'll be wealthier than you in a couple of years' time. You hoist yourself up with these 50% targets. You put them on Twitter, the propaganda unit go mad, and you never, ever, ever, ever hit your recycling targets. It's the same as it was in May 2010. But what I'd like you to remember is think about those scratch cards, and then you can laugh about your failed recycling targets later.
Okay, we'll go to Councillor Holden and then Councillor Draper, and then we'll try and go back to James.
Okay, well, thank you for Councillor Dean's comments. He has a good point about recycling, but I don't want to talk about recycling. I want to ask about income levels generated from PCNs. Now, it's come to my attention over the summer that a very large number of people, as yet I don't know how many, have been receiving PCNs despite having valid permits. Do you have a handle on that? Because that surely must be an income stream increase, because previously people auto-renew their permits quite easily. Now with e-permits, people are receiving fines even though they have legitimate permits, and I've already got quite a few cancelled and people are very happy about that. So can you sort of answer how many PCNs have been issued and how much income raised, and also how many have been given back to the public when their fault has been proven to be with the council, not with the individual?
Chair, if I could ask Kath to answer that, because I know she's much closer to the detail there.
Yeah, sure. So firstly, any permits that have been issued in error or have been doubled in error or what have you, those refunds have been made to all of the people concerned. You know, and if council is aware of anybody that hasn't had a refund, then please do come back to me, and I will get that sorted, because you know we are aware that there was a glitch with the Ringo system. We are where it wasn't necessarily putting through all the registrations onto the handhelds where the CEOs wrote on street. We worked with Ringo very quickly to try to resolve that problem. We apologised immediately because that was an error. One system didn't talk to the other system, which shouldn't have happened. The system had been live since January, but we ended up in a run of glitches. That has now been resolved. The systems are back talking to each other and will remain talking to each other to the best of my knowledge. But as I say, you know, we did apologise to those customers concerned. It certainly wasn't a position we wanted to find ourselves in. But, you know, no additional revenue has come into the council through a genuine error from the customer. And as I said, if you are aware of any of those, then I'd be happy to pick them up.
Councillor Draper, and then we'll go on back to James.
Yeah, it's just a very brief question again to Kat about scratch cards, because I know that we are far from the first council to computerise the permits. And I'm wondering if other councils, I'm thinking specifically Kingston, for instance, have had any difficulties on the lines that Councillor Dean has suggested, because I believe they've had computerised parking for quite a long time now.
I'm not aware of the Kingston system, if I'm entirely honest. You know, scratch cards are incredibly popular in Merton, and they have been a system that's been very, very well subscribed. You know, as we move forward, there's certainly no intention to look to disadvantage elements of the community. There are ways in which we can, provide additional digital services within parking, but we certainly wouldn't do that without a significant amount of consultation. And I don't know of any a borough. I live in Bristol. I certainly know Bristol City does not advertise anything other than their electronic visitor permits. But I also know that if you are a member of the public that can't access them electronically and you contact the council, there are other ways and means that they provide that service through local libraries and other contact points. So, we are very, very well aware of that system, and certainly we would look to consult before we were to change it going into the future. When we had to suspend that service in the first lockdown, we were very mindful that that wasn't particularly helpful, albeit nobody in the country was moving around. In this lockdown, we're not proposing over the next 4 weeks to suspend that service at all.
That's really helpful.
Okay, thank you. We're going to move back to James, I'm afraid, because I think we have had to wait a long time for poor James to try this again. So this is the third time we're going to do this. James, can you come in here? I can't hear you. Hang on. Are you coming in on your phone?
Chair, James has dialed in by phone.
Ah, okay. Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, I can hear you.
Well, I hope the button was made. I feel like a comeback tour from the.
Yeah, we can.
Repeating. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Great. So I'm doing a two-hander with Rosie. Rosie's got the presentation. I'm going to talk to that, and hopefully I'll be able to take questions at the end of it. So this piece is called Towards a Housing Strategy. This is a piece of work that we're doing jointly with our colleagues in the housing needs of Steve Langley's service, and with Phil indeed in his team.
Can everybody see the presentation?
Yes, we can see.
Yeah, you might need to minimise it a bit, Rosie.
Okay. Well, thanks, Rosie. If you can move on to the next slide.
That's it.
Yeah. So the why does Merton need a housing strategy? Well, actually, statutorily, we are not required to do a housing strategy. As you're aware, we're not a stock owning authority, and we transferred our properties to Circle Housing, now Clarion, over 10 years ago. But we do recognise that it's good practice to have a housing strategy, and that's because we've got to make sure that we are supporting the various types of housing needs, and we've set out some here: supported care, genuinely affordable housing, and I'll come back to that later on in the presentation, as well as low-cost home ownership and working with private landlords, and also gypsies and travellers are an important part of some of the work we do with the housing strategy. We had anticipated that we'd be coming to Scrutiny panel at this time with an outline of the pre-scrutiny on the report we'd be taking to Cabinet. But I think a combination of the impacts of COVID has meant that we're actually now working through some of those issues, as well as using the time to more thoughtfully go through some of the issues that have been arising through some of the research that's been done by our appointed consultants. So what we want to do is work with the housing strategy to be seen as a complementary strategy to the local plan, and members are aware that consultation on that starts this month, as well as strategies like the homelessness and rough sleeper strategy. We really feel that one of the main purposes of the housing strategy is that we have clarity with our housing association partners, our RP stakeholders, with developers and applicants when they're submitting planning applications, and most crucially that it's clear to residents what our priorities are, and it also helps set out what we're seeking funding for from the GLA and indeed other funders that may come into play. And we really have a vision which is that we don't have a static document. We want it to be something that can develop along with our planning policies, that we get good growth and that we get the right type of housing, the right size that's needed for our local communities and our local residents. So Rosie, if you can move on one. So to set out what's being done today and some of that wider policy context, as we know, the new local plan's out for consultation this month. We've also done something which we're required to do, which is a strategic housing land availability assessment. So that's called the SHLA. That was done in 2017. We do update that. We've updated that since then. But that's really setting out what land's available in Merton. That's done on a London-wide scale by the GLA. And just putting some context there, the SHLA has identified right across London that there's almost 650,000 homes could be built on the land available from the 2019-2010 years ahead. We also undertook and recommissioned our SMA, which is the Strategic Housing Market Assessment, and that really delves deeply into what's the nature of the housing that's needed in the borough by our residents. We also commissioned work which was to undertake a local plan housing viability study, and this is really looking at all the competing issues that applicants have in terms of the cost of bringing their sites forward. How did we look at housing as part of that viability assessment? And we're also undertaking work in Steve Langley's team on the homelessness and rough sleepers strategy. Rosie, if you could move on one. Thanks. So some of the key findings, some of this will be very familiar to you, but I think it's worth repeating that in terms of the London plan, Merton's housing target is due to go up from 411 new homes per year to 918 homes per year. You'll be aware that the London plan is still going through its final approval process, but we anticipate the amount of housing will be in that order. If you look at the SHMAS, or the Strategic Housing Market Needs Assessment, it's telling us that we'll need between 878 and 1,084 affordable homes per annum. That we need new affordable homes in all parts of the borough. Affordable homes cover shared ownership, first homes, starter homes, as well as affordable rent, and increasingly through the London plan, the London living rent. But what we've identified through some of the work that we've undertaken is that affordable housing tenures addresses the in terms of shared ownership and other types of home ownership, probably addresses the least number of housing requirements for affordable housing. Therefore, by default, the majority is through affordable rent. There's approximately 450 units built each year in Merton. And again, it's worth restating that 90% of the planning applications in Merton are on small sites that don't actually trip the affordable housing policy. So we rely on larger sites to enable our housing target to be reached. Thanks, Rosie. If you move on, that'd be great. So towards the housing strategy, I think what we want to make sure is this is something that's not just about what Merton does with its land, but how we maximise the benefit from private developers. And some of the issues that we'll be facing and we'll be developing as we move forward is, do we go for the number of affordable homes, so in focus in reaching our target, or do we go for providing a maximum amount of affordable housing, that's at affordable rents, which are more expensive, which impact on the viability of schemes? And those are things that as we go through to a conclusion on the housing strategy, we'll need to determine how those priorities line up. So do we go for reaching our target figure in the London plan, our 40% affordable housing, 50% on public land, or do we say actually we'd rather have the maximum amount of affordable rent, whereas in some schemes we're getting 100% affordable, but they're actually all shared ownership. Putting that in some context of Merton's share of London's new homes, the purple shows the sites and the homes delivered to date. The green is projecting and moving forward. You'll see the red line is our target, and you'll see the jump from 2019, 2021. So that's anticipating the new London plan target. And you'll see that by and large we've reached our targets in the past, but you'll see that it's more challenging as we move forward, both in absolute numbers. But you'll see that the darker green is the projected housing numbers coming from large sites, and you'll see that the paler green is coming from small sites, and you'll see that those are the ones where there's a lot more work involved, but they actually represent 90% of the sites coming forward in Merton. So that creates challenges for the future. Thanks, Rosie. You move forward. So we appointed Campbell Tickell as a specialist consultancy in the housing field towards the end of 2019, anticipating that we'd be with you this evening talking about the adoption of the housing strategy. But what they've done in the time that they had available prior to lockdown and subsequently is they've directly engaged with registered providers or housing association partners, and they've held some workshops with LBM officers. And we've also commissioned some work on housing delivery. During July to September, we had some consultants called ICINI to ask residents their views on housing delivery in Merton. And we did that through social media. I'm particularly wanting to hear from younger people living in the east of Merton, because there's, through the strategic housing needs assessment, we determined those were groups who were in greater need of housing moving forward. And you'll see in this slide the dilemmas that's thrown up. The question one, what do you consider as successful housing in Merton? You'll see that people by and large want terraced housing or lower height accommodation, and it tails off to only 7% when we're talking about taller flatted accommodation. And then we contrast that with question two, which was what are the priorities for future housing delivery in Merton? And you'll see that affordability of homes is right there at the top, along with good quality design. And that creates the challenge because that has a clear impact on the financial viability of bringing sites forward. We're also working on not just general needs housing, and indeed with Phil and with Steve, we're looking at just the provision of affordable rented accommodation. So that's targeting those residents in the borough in the lowest income brackets. That's in addition to the emerging local plan that will pick up on the London plans, London living rent. And what we want to do is to target those residents who are genuinely finding it difficult to afford the rents currently. And you'll see that there's about 9,800 households in the council housing register. That gives you a scale of the problem. There's probably about 15 affordable homes to rent in Merton out of 86,000 homes in the borough. So it's a minority that are affordable rent. And the council has probably about 250 affordable rented properties coming forward each year. So again, it gives you a sense of the quantum that's available to us. We're also looking at supported living, so the specialist needs, and we are also that along with extra care housing, realising we've got an ageing population, so there'll be requirements for special needs accommodation, adapted housing, and again, we've got to find provision for our Gypsies and Traveller communities. We've got one site at Brickfield Road, and the Mayor of London's local plan anticipates that we will need some additional pitches. So what it tells us is, although we have some opportunities, we've got the new local plan that's identifying more sites. We've got the borough character area study, which is along with the small sites toolkit, is how do we maximise the benefit from those sites. We've also got the housing delivery research that says that it's people prefer smaller terraced housing to high-rise developments, which clearly give us greater volume in terms of numbers. How do we use the housing company from the council set up to look at opportunities for bringing housing forward? There's the perception of increasing housing delivery, and I think that's the study by ICINI really showed that people understand the needs, but they don't necessarily want it in their locale. But we also need to work effectively with our housing association partners to maximise the opportunities for them in terms of their land, but also early engagement with them when we're speaking to developers for larger sites. But I wouldn't want to underestimate there are some significant barriers. There's a lack of large sites. Registered providers have hitherto preferred sites where their involvement is at least 50 units. So if you think about that being potentially 50% of affordable housing, you're talking about sites of 100 units plus. And just going back to the 90% are 10 units or less. Land assembly is difficult. It's fragmented in terms of ownership, and we have some very high land prices in Merton. The wider economic situation is going on at the moment, and again, one of the barriers is the perception. It's got its good side that people recognise it, but it's also people don't necessarily want it in their locale. So that set up a number of areas where we need to consider, and these are the things that we will work through in the weeks and the months ahead. So setting up a developer forum, making sure that the development industry knows what Merton's looking for in terms of housing, particularly affordable housing, when it sees developments being brought forward. Look at the specialist care needs that we have and how we prioritise them. Through good quality design and therefore reviewing and update design codes, how we can make sure that local residents' perception of the quality of housing is maintained. We want to relaunch our registered provider forum, so that's about having greater engagement with our housing association partners. There's about half a dozen key partners, but there might be others there that can provide specialist accommodation. What can we do with the local housing company, Ranton Development Limited? We're looking at what's the re-establishment of the housing revenue account. What would that mean for the council, both in terms of financial implications, process, and whether it's an opportunity or whether it's something that, with the transfer of the stock to Clarion, is something that's not a sensible proposition. We need to look at the funding models that are out there, whether that be using loan funding or central government opportunities. There's the GLA, but also increasingly Homes England are a provider of funding even within London. We need to look at how we assemble land, potentially how we use surplus industrial land or open space that's not protected land. And these are big and significant questions to ask councillors as well as residents. And we also want to consider whether off-site production modular housing it will accelerate the development of housing in the borough, or whether it brings economies of scale or to the financial viability. So in terms of our next steps is completing that overarching work and pulling that together. We realise that there are some areas where we need to dive deeper, and indeed Phil's working to provide information that will assess the specialist care housing in Merton and therefore how we provide for that. Continued proactive engagement with our housing association registered providers. Maximise the number of sites that are coming through the local plan, but also to assess the impact of COVID-19 on housing services. Now you had the presentation today on terms of housing from Clarion Housing in terms of repairs, maintenance and ongoing management issues. But during the COVID period, we've also had a moratorium on evictions, and we may see through the impact of COVID on the economy a greater number of people falling out of home ownership and looking for affordable rented solutions, and all of those things need to be factored in. So as officers, we're now working through those. We anticipate a final draft in spring 2021, so around about March time we'll have worked through some of those issues, and we believe the impacts of COVID may become more apparent during those times in terms of the economy, and we'll look to then produce a draft housing strategy, which we'd be happy to bring back to scrutiny then as a more meaningful document. So I'll leave it there, but happy to take questions.
Councillor Butler messaged me, and then I'll go to Councillor Dean.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for that presentation. I have a few points, but yeah, I think my main point would be there's quite a few things that are left to have detail on and for people to be consulted there. My first issue, for me personally in my ward, High Path Estate is in my ward, and there's already a lot of people that are relying on social level of rents, let alone affordable level of rents, which again, as you've inferred in your report, you've added the word genuinely affordable as a qualifier to that, but then you used as an example of our very large housing waiting list as people that we need to be considering here, that I imagine won't look at what's currently affordable as affordable at all. Would be a kind of comment at the start there to be considered. But you say in your presentation a lot of the challenges that you have are with small developments not being able to secure the affordable level of housing in those. But then you go on to say we haven't got many large sites that are viable, so we really do have to rely on those small sites to be producing those affordable levels of housing. I'm also hearing, you know, there are potential things coming down from the government that would put us even more on a back foot in terms of a planning situation. All this kind of comes to, you know, what levers can we be pulling as a borough to be to really nail those smaller developments down? I've just got one example before I'll let you add more detail there. There's been a few planning applications that I've seen in the last couple of years where there's multiple small ones in a site or near a site or on an existing site that don't need to go through these viability tests, but if they were considered on a larger scale or had to kind of link with our local plan even more strongly, then they would be accountable on an affordable level with that. There's a lot going on there in my response, but yeah, if you could just add a bit more detail on the small developments and what levers we can pull there.
Thank you, Councillor. I think on the small developments, there's a number of things that we're aiming to do. One is that we're looking at how do you get greater density on the site but still maintain quality, so that actually per site you can generate more housing numbers. Now that both ultimately delivers outright greater numbers, but it also would mean that we're able to improve the economics of each site, so we can actually bring forward more affordable housing. I think I'd go back to one of the points, which was the going for absolute numbers versus for genuinely affordable accommodation. And those are things that we need to have flexible enough policies that we can look at them on a site-by-site basis, and that we can work with our housing needs colleagues to determine at that moment in time, looking at the housing list, not just the total number of figures, but the nature of the residents on that housing list. What's the type of housing that can be delivered? We also need to look at new types of approach to family housing. So that's about not necessarily having terraced or semi-detached, but how can we get apartment living for larger families? And those are all challenges, because when we looked at the work that we commissioned on the delivery of the affordable housing, people understood the issue, but would prefer lower rise, lower density housing. So the policies are about how do you get good quality housing when it's a slightly higher density, or provides a different type of housing for families to the traditional standalone or semi-detached house. But I think it's making sure that we have a flexible set of tools in our arsenal to have those discussions with potential applicants. What we're not able to do is to mass up a number of sites that are not contiguous with each other, even though they're in the same area. But it may be looking at more carefully and seeing whether or not there are some master planning activities that we should be doing that can bring different landowners together to see whether or not there's opportunities for them to benefit in terms of the amount of housing that they will deliver on each site by joining up with neighbouring sites, and therefore deliver more housing in total. And that will give us greater ability to see if the viability assessments allow for a greater amount of affordable housing. But I think it will come down to, in many respects, whether or not we go for genuinely affordable housing and have lower absolute affordable housing outputs in terms of numbers, rather than reach our 40%, but perhaps deliver it through a large amount of shared ownership housing.
Councillor Dean and then Councillor Draper, please.
So thank you very much for the presentation. So it's very interesting that when you sit on planning committee, the vast majority of homes that come through are 1 and 2 bedroom, but the local plan for the last decade has said that a third should be 3 bedrooms plus. And looking at the housing plan, it's clear that overcrowding is one of the critical reasons that people need rehousing, but there truly isn't enough 3-bedroom stock that's being built. So it's about numbers rather than quantity of bedrooms. I'd also say that The St Helier estate is a magnificent estate. It's high quality, it's high density, and it's amazing when you do something right that people don't follow it. But it really should be followed, because there's been some appalling blocks of flats put in the centre of Mitcham, appalling houses that are built that everyone says, why on earth was that done? When we've got classic high density, low cost housing, which is already there, and we should copy that. And one last thing I note at the end there, James, when you quietly mentioned building on open space, you'll look within the council's own plans. A lot of people don't have a park near them. There isn't enough sports and leisure. We keep being harangued by Labour to say there's a climate change emergency. We have told by the EU we have toxic air. The very, very last thing you want to do is make lives for people even more miserable. If you're going to build something, follow your consultation. People want low rise, they want terrace, they want high quality, and they want low cost. They don't mention building on green space. They don't want to live in high rise. They're the kind of answers that the council needs to deliver.
Okay, we'll go to Councillor Draper and then to Councillor Pritchard after James has come back on those points. Sorry.
Yeah. I think picking up on the planning committee, we liaise with our colleagues in housing needs to determine within the design parameters of any application what the house types, so number of bedrooms, and I think it does throw up that we need to look and see how we can deliver larger family units, but not necessarily within a traditional terrace or semi-detached or detached housing. Because I think, David, they fully understand that the St Helier estate is a very good example of the expansion of London. I think in terms of the housing need now, and with our land availability, it just wouldn't help us contribute towards the housing numbers. So we need to look and see how do we maintain good quality development, having good access to open space, having good access to town centres and amenities, but perhaps not in such a land hungry way. But I just want to be clear, we're in terms of open space, we're not talking about any open space as any form of protection, metropolitan open land or land protected with our local plan. But there are miscellaneous plots of land dotted around the borough. Some of those might have been former housing land, we call it HRA land, that were previously part of the housing estates. There may be capacity to build some land there. So it's by no means looking at a wholesale review of our open space.
Okay, Councillor Draper and then Councillor Pritchard, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Chair. It's looking at what Councillor Dean has just said from a slightly different perspective. And I remember when I was Cabinet Member for Housing, Samantha George, Councillor George, suggested that when we were redeveloping High Path, we should do so by removing all the high rise that was there, and replacing it with 1/2-story buildings, each with its own garden, and keeping the same number of people on the High Path, and everybody having a parking space. The problem with that, of course, is you can't actually fit them. And the question I was going to ask was, why have we actually asked people whether they prefer to have terraced housing or housing, when, quite frankly, there isn't room for the terraced housing? One interesting thing that Councillor Dean probably does know about is that Morden Park exists because the Hatfields were going to sell it to make even more housing in Morden. And the council at that time decided to actually buy the land so that there was some green open space within Morden. And the reality is that if we don't build the kind of accommodation that is built elsewhere in London, I mean, not just in central London, I mean, you look at Croydon, you look at Sutton, you see the higher rise buildings that are being made there, that we're not actually going to be able to achieve either our targets or our affordability. we're just not going to be able to do it at all. I have to say, if I was looking at this, I start again from scratch. Sorry about that.
James, do you want to come back on any of that?
Well, I think it's only just to re-emphasise that I don't quality and the type of units we build and the need for a greater number of units aren't incompatible. But I think that when we ask people the question, we see we recognise the dilemma. People would like a lower rise, a lower density, but equally there are very successful parts of London, including indeed very successful parts of Merton, where you have higher density living in proximity to good quality amenities. And we need to be able to demonstrate to win the hearts and minds of our local residents that that's something that we can achieve. Otherwise, we will have a almost near impossible challenge in how we deliver our housing numbers.
Councillor Holden? Oh, sorry, no, Councillor Pritchard, and then Councillor Holden, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Just responding really to David's comments. I actually agree with one of David's main points about the 3 bedrooms, and I think one of the things that a lot of London has problem with is that we're just building homes that either lead to transient populations because they then have to move away, or they lead to overcrowded families as families grow, and that is not good in either way, because one is the latter is poor quality of living, and the former leads to I believe poor community issues, because people are just moving and then having to move out to find somewhere that will accommodate their house. And I don't think any of us want localities, want Merton to be like that. We want them to be community. We want longevity of families within communities and all those things that come with it. So absolutely, I agree with that. On the issue of high rise, most people on here, I'm sure Councillor Dean and I'm sure Councillor and I'm sure James is aware as well, actually, that I made a statement against sewers and the building high of there, because I felt that 10 was too high. I do think that, however, there is a happy medium. And we must always be mindful of this, is that although no one ever dreams of living in a high rise, it is better to live in a high rise than to be homeless, right? And that is fundamental to this, is that we must remember that we have to speak on behalf of the people on the waiting list as much as we do anyone else, and the people who need to get home, to get in. I stand by what I said previously. I think that too much density is a bad thing, but just dismissing high rises out of hand is a mistake. And then linked to that, I do think there is a compounding issue, though, actually, and this goes back to David's point about the the size that people living plus high rise, is that if we compound those two things of making the homes small and transient and not lovely to live in, and therefore not loved as homes, just seen as shelters, and simultaneously build too high, all we're doing is creating the ghettos of tomorrow, where people don't have a sense of place, and indeed any place they have a sense of is negative, because they want to move from that estate, right? So I don't think, the complexity of this is hard, and no one underestimates that, but we're going to have to build what some people on here would refer to as high, because people need homes. But we have to do so in a way that enables community, right? So that's linked to amenities, a place they want to stay and can stay as their family grows and their needs grow and as their children grow. And I don't think places, and I'll go back to sewers because I'm on record and I've looked into that. I'm sure there are many other examples, but I don't think what was offered in Benedict's Wharf did that, right? And it went too far the one way. And I know that isn't all this council. There's elements to do with the London Authority as well. But we need to be grown up in this, and it's no longer good enough just to listen to community lobby groups who only complain about aesthetics, right? There is a real issue with getting homes for these people, but they're quality homes. So none of us should hang around on sort of great rhetorical statements of don't build here, wouldn't everything be lovely if it was a two-story Georgian, right? But we need to find a way that gets us all forward in a way and provides the housing that we need for the people on the waiting list now.
Chair, would you like me to come back? I think you're absolutely right. Capturing a lot of what's been said, they are competing demands. And what we want to do is to make sure that we've got a housing strategy that understands and recognises that, but allows us to have conversations with planning applicants to say this is what we need and how can it be delivered. The early discussions with the applicant may allow us to have conversations about how can you accommodate 3 and even 4 bed properties within. My definition of high rise probably isn't 10 stories, but that's a discussion for another day. But it's within medium to high rise. How can we accommodate some of those bigger housing? But it's not just about the housing; it's the setting it's in, and how people access both amenity space, quality open space. But if we don't have those conversations at an early point, we may lose the opportunity. What we need to ensure is that the housing strategy gives officers a clear mandate to go out and have those conversations. It also means that we'll be able to maximise the opportunity to accelerate delivery, and that brings with it the opportunity to get government, local and London government funding. But I wouldn't want to say that what we've got at this moment in time are all the answers within the housing strategy. We know these are competing demands, and we need to weigh them up. We also need to make sure that what we do is that we are able to tie those in with some of the overarching policies that come in with the London plan and indeed central government policies that take some of these things out of our hands. What we need to do.
Out of interest, James, you said you didn't regard it as high rise. What do you regard? What are the classifications you use? Bearing in mind this is Merton, not Manhattan.
Yeah. So I think that and if you look at some of the developments in Merton that are 8, 9, 10 stories, I think that's probably a fairly typical high building in Merton, and we don't envisage many buildings being much higher than that. But actually, it's not what you would call in sort of the definition of a high rise, but within a Merton context, it's a high building. So without sort of wanting to get into the semantics of it,
yeah, I do think there is an important point here, nonetheless, is that we're looking for Merton's solutions, and therefore everything's in the context of Merton, right? Is that the notion that you know what I mean, because they've done it elsewhere, isn't actually perfectly right for us. Is that within the context of standing next to a conservation area and an old church, 10 stories is pretty bloody high, mate. And if people term it high rise, I think I'm not going to kind of disagree with them, I must confess.
Yeah, just to be clear, they mentioned the character area studies within the work that informs the housing strategy, and that is recognising that there are places where we have to be all throughout the borough respectful of the nature, and there might be some places where there can be higher buildings, but as a whole, Merton will not be a borough dominated by high-rise developments. But I think there are we need to respect the character of the borough. Where there are opportunities and where it can work in that context, we'll look at it. But I think we do recognise that Merton's not going to be a borough of skyscrapers, and that's. But also, there's a law of diminishing returns when you get to high buildings that actually don't necessarily meet housing needs because the cost once you go beyond a certain height is prohibitive in terms of affordable accommodation. But it is about having an understanding of what our housing needs are. It's been mentioned a number of times that we need to make sure we get bigger family homes. We need to see how we can accommodate those as part of the mix with the 1 and 2 bed properties that are needed. And within the sites that come forward, what we recognise is that the housing strategy needs to be able to be flexible enough to be, look at each site as it comes forward. But clearly, we understand that we want to say, is it genuinely affordable rents that we want to progress in terms of affordable accommodation, and therefore we can have those early conversations with the planning applicants to see how they can get that quality within their scheme. That's a departure from how we would previously have looked at a housing strategy. We see the housing strategy far more about how do we get delivery of particularly affordable housing, rather than it's a document that sets out policies and we're not clear enough with applicants on how we would want those to be actually built out. And just to reiterate that we don't see high-rise being on every site as being anywhere near the solution for Merton, and it is very much in the context of the developments that are brought forward.
Okay, can I go to Councillor Holden and then go to Councillor Draper, please?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Housing strategies all sound very interesting, but it sounds like just another target set and tick box and exercise without any clear indication of delivery. So my question is more about how can we get sort of small, medium and large providers or developers to be interested in this, and how do we get big landholders like the GLA and even the council itself to work out how to do things? Because, I mean, one example, of course, is Morden. There were plans for that to have 1,000 new houses or homes, and then all of a sudden that's gone to pot. So it's all well and good having these nice things, but do you have any idea how we're going to actually achieve it?
So I think there's the short-term impact of the funding constraints are very challenging. That's both in terms of accessing affordable housing grant and grants to do with land assembly, as you've mentioned, that impact on Morden. But I think what we have to do is set our stall out for the next 5 to 10 years, and we have to have a picture that is one of which is consistent and credible when we talk to London and central government, because I think the key thing that they look at is that it's not a plan on a page; it's actually something that can be delivered, and that's about us having the certainty that it's something that the development industry buys into, local residents see as being of the quality for their neighbourhood, and ultimately can be worthy of planning approval. And I think it's making sure that we bring forward schemes that have those. We have the early engagement with the funders and the applicants. We're clear on what the housing needs are, and we actually talk about how you could get on site and get delivery. Because a lot of sites are ones where the barriers are not about planning per se, but it's about what are our specific needs on that site in terms of housing. And that's something I think the housing strategy's objective is that we can make sure we've got clarity when we have the conversation with whether it be the public or the private sector when we're talking about bringing sites forward. And I think that's a key element of the housing strategy moving forward.
Councillor Draper, please.
Again, quickly, thank you very much, Chair. Yeah, I'm going to back Owen up, I think, by saying that I've just objected to Criterion's idea of a 26-storey building in the middle of Collier's Wood. So yeah, I think that tall buildings are okay, but they have to be in proportion. The one thing that I would say is that we aren't an island. We are a small borough in the middle of lots of other boroughs. And if you look at what's happening in Wandsworth, in Croydon, in Sutton, in Kingston, you see that people are building up. And if we're not careful, we're going to be a situation where we become an oasis of low rise, surrounded by others. And you know what that means? That means that only people who can afford to come to actually live here or eventually live here will be turning people away, saying, you can't come to Merton because we haven't got any places to live because we only want low rise. And that's not good for our existing population. It's not good for generations going down the line. We actually have to think about this sensibly. Thank you very much.
I think Councillor Walton wanted to come in and just say a few comments.
Thank you, Chair. I think this has been an incredibly useful discussion to have with Scrutiny and the engagement in terms of housing. I think the last housing strategy was done in 2012, at the end of my first tenure as housing cabinet member. And I have to say then, the challenges have got much more acute in terms of deliverability of generally affordable homes. There has been proposals that have come forward in the borough in terms of shared ownership, where you'd be looking at 65,000 income to actually take an equity in it, which I think is far outside many people's salary. I think in terms of 3-bedroom homes, I think there has been very many salient points in terms of the number of lettings last year for 3 bedrooms. They were 33 in this borough, and anyone who represents a ward like myself in Pollard Hill, where you have a large number of people living in 1 and 2 bedroom housing, suffering overcrowding, knows there is a desperate need for larger family size homes, especially in terms of social housing. That's one of the good things about the High Path development, that it will, and Eastfields and Ravensbury is dealing with those overcrowding issues. And we also have to remember as well, we have 9,000 people on the waiting list here in Merton. We do suffer from a lack of land availability. We are not a Barking or Dagenham, which have swathes of land to be developed. We are a heavily built up borough, but obviously when you take into account MOL, strategic industrial land, the options are more challenging. In terms of the number of storey buildings, I think we have to get the balance. A lot of them are going higher and higher, not just in Merton, but in other places. But I think an important part of that is in relation to amenity space and the design and build. A lot of the high-rise buildings are much higher quality than some of the shoddy developments we had back in the 1960s, which were an absolute disaster. But I think it's something we also have to consider in the context that in order to get the level of affordable homes you need, it means going higher. The more grant we have, the more opportunity there is available for housing to be provided. And the one thing obviously that we are looking at is a potential of having a housing revenue account and undertaking further work on that. Some of you may have seen that Bromley recently set one up, who are one of the 4 authorities like Merton that don't have a housing revenue account. They've decided to set one up. It's something that I've asked to look in to that, because increasing the supply of homes is something I'm passionate about, because we've got a big housing crisis here. Many people are increasingly priced out here as well, but also as well in terms of homes for social rent and having generally affordable homes. So housing is not an easy case, and if that planning white paper comes into effect, it will become even more problematic, given that one of the proposals is that anything under 40 units will not have to provide affordable homes, and also as well the changes in terms of section 106, which I think is a detrimental retrograde step, and that's planning cabinet member made representations on this point. But it's a debate I think we need to have within the council, but also as well in terms of shaping the place and what we want to see in Merton, because we know that housing is one of the biggest concerns out there. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody. I think it was a pretty good discussion. I'm just going to close there. I'm kind of out of kilter, so I'm just going to go to the work programme, which is what the end of the last item on our agenda. And just to mention that we have an extra meeting on the 8th of December about emissions-based charging. So that's that. Is there any other comment on the work programme? Everybody okay?
Yeah, I'm fine with that. The 8th of December meeting. When will that be definitively confirmed?
I think Rosie sent out an email, didn't she?
Was that still a holding one?
I did, Chair. I sent out a holding email, and I have sent out a calendar invite since then, so it has been confirmed with parking services.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Is this your last meeting, Natasha?
No, I'm staying here forever. Right, thank you very much, everybody. Have a lovely evening, and I'm going to go now. So, because I have a small child kicking me in the stomach, and I need to have a comfort break. So I'm going to head off now. Thank you very much, everybody. That was a really good discussion, and we'll see each other again soon. Take care. Bye bye.
Okay, bye, Natasha. Bye.